Well, I'm on the final days of my vacation, and I got my Ford Escape in here. I'm going to change the brakes on it, and air filter, and cabin air filter. And then also I got to change the blower resistor that's been bad on it for about a year. I just been living with it, but it's time to get it changed. Did a good waxing to it here yesterday. Shining really good. I got to make sure I take care of this thing because it's going to have to last me a long time. And so I'll get started on the brakes here in a second. I got my Pandora radio on John Lee Hooker Blues, so that's the way I work, is with music in the background. If YouTube doesn't like it, well, they know where to stick it. Well, about 29,000 miles on these brakes, and they've pretty much had it. I knew they were pretty bad. And I don't know if you can see very well with the camera there, but I'm pretty much done for. So I'm going to shut the camera off here for a minute. What you want to do is you want to squeeze this caliper in a little bit, because there's always a little bit of a ridge on these rotors. I'll have to measure those rotors. I think they're probably not wore out, but I'm going to measure them and see. Make sure I don't have any porosity or anything on them. I'd rather not replace the rotors unless I had to, but if I do, I will. So I'm going to shut this off, and I'll be back once I get a little bit further. Well, whenever I collapse the caliper piston, I always pull the lid off of this. There's a bit of an argument on whether you should or you shouldn't. I always do. I found in the past, if you don't do that, then you build up a bunch of pressure in there. And then when next time you pull that thing off, well, then you got brake fluid blowing everywhere. And then when you collapse this piston, do it slowly. Let's see. So yeah, there's like a spot back there you can put to one side of the C-clamp. And then I always have one that has the center removed. You're not keeping these pads anyways. So you press on that, and then just slowly, a little bit at a time, squeeze that in. a little bit until you get it loose. And that should keep from introducing air in your system if you do it just a little bit at a time. Wait, squeeze a little bit, wait, and then have your top off your master cylinder. So I'm going to continue on this, and I'll start the video whenever there's something important to see. Well, some guy was crying in my last video when I did this on a 2008 Ford Escape of my mother's that I didn't show how to get this clip out. Well, this is basically how I do it. I compress that a little bit with a C-clamp, and then you can see the little tabs in there. I compress it till that tab's almost exposed, and then I pry it out with a screwdriver. It's going to be kind of hard to get that on camera because I'm going to need both hands to do this, but that's essentially how I did it. So if that guy happens to be watching this video, I hope I didn't waste his 5 minutes this time. Well, here's an example of Ford idiocity that I thought maybe had changed in the past 40 years, but this is the sort of thing that I ran into way back when I was working on vintage Fords. I knew there was a small and a large piston on these Ford Escapes, and I did the research, and from what I could tell, if you had a build date before 7/27 of 2010, you had one, and after 7/27/2010, you had the other. Now, I didn't know which was which, but I do know that my Escape, I bought it in October of 2010, even though it's a 2011, and the build date on it was September of 2010. So my assumption was, well, they probably improved it and put the larger piston on the newer Ford Escape. Well, as you can see, that's not the case. So I got to run all the way back downtown and get the correct brake pad. Notice the difference there? One's the large, that's for the large piston, which is what I thought I had, and what I actually have is the small piston. So I gotta run clear downtown and get the right brakes. So I'll be back. Well, it's about 45 minutes later. Of course, I decided to go about the time that all the school buses were out. So it took me forever to get down there and back, but now I've got the right brake pads. If you can see, the clip is a small clip. And the part number on these is a 1047B rather than the other ones were 1047A. I come to find out, we did some comparing down at Advance, and they pulled out their Wagner Thermo Torque, or whatever the heck they're called, Quiet Torque or whatever, and compared them with these wear-over Platinums, and they have the same part number and literally look identical for about $10 less. So that's why I got them, and actually they didn't have any specifically for this vehicle anyways. They had one for the earlier Ford Escapes. It was just a 1047. So I decided to get the $10 cheaper ones, and they look to be literally identical. I mean, the pads were the same color. They had the same pattern on them and everything with the same part number. That tells me the Wagner probably supplies them with the so-called platinum premium ceramic pads. So anyways, this might be a good point here to maybe gather a little bit of information on which one you may have. The build date on my particular Ford Escape was September of 2010. It's a 2011 model. It was bought fairly early in the model year, and I purchased it in October of 2010, and it has the small piston. Now if you look around on the websites, especially if you're going to buy a Motorcraft pad, there will be a cutoff date 7/27 of 2010. Previous to that is one pad, and after that is another pad. And that must be the cutoff date, and it appears, at least as far as mine, since the build date of it was 9 of 2010, that the later ones take what they call the small piston. Now the piston itself I don't believe is actually smaller. If you take a look at it here, let me get the light back on. I don't have my doors open quite yet, but I don't think that this piston is actually smaller as far as the actual outside diameter, but what they did is they made the inside diameter smaller, maybe for additional strength heat dissipation, I don't know. I really don't have any idea what was going on here, so this may be a bit of a learning experience for all of us. If other people have maybe changed these pads and see this particular video, maybe they can give their input on what they ran into. But it appears as though, at least from what I can tell, just with my own personal Ford Escape with the build date of 9/2010, that after 7/27 of 2010 you will need the small pads if you have the Ford Escape XLT with a 3-liter. But like I said, other people, if they give their input, maybe we can kind of come up with a consensus that's really true or not. But at least in my case, that is the truth. Now I got to get going on this thing. Well, one commenter on my other video on doing these brakes said, well, why don't you just pull those pins out of there rather than pulling the entire caliper out? And yeah, it does probably make it a little bit easier. And actually, you just pull one out, flip the thing up. But if you look at that, that's a socket head pin. So in other words, it takes an Allen wrench. So what size Allen wrench is that? Well, my 6mm doesn't fit, it's too small. My 8mm is too big. None of my standards fit, so that tells me it's a 7mm. I don't have a single 7mm in my whole shop. Every Allen wrench set that I have goes from 6 to 8. So I'd have to buy a special Allen wrench in order to do that. Meanwhile, I already have an offset 18mm wrench to take those two larger bolts out. And it just, you get that thing out of there and everything's right out in the open. You can inspect the rotors a lot easier and everything. So I pull the whole thing off of there and I slide this out the back side without pulling the pins out. Then I could get in there and clean those grooves out where this will ride. Get that all nice and clean. And then I can use a little bit of that graphite lube on there, and also use that on here as well to make sure everything slides nice and easily and you don't end up with uneven pad wear. So yeah, you could pull one of those pins out and just flip the whole works up and leave everything bolted onto the whatever you want to call it, the knuckle or the spindle or whatever do they call them now. But I do it this way, and I'm going to continue to do it this way. Now I've got this thing together. Use a little bit of lube on each one of those ears. I forgot to show how to put that clip on. That thing's an absolute pain in the rear end. I kind of put it on similar to the way I take it off. I take this C-clamp and I close it up more than what it needs to be, and then basically wrench that thing on there. And then I can't do it while I'm holding the camera, but as I'm holding that on there, I've got this in my other hand and I kind of give that a tap until it slides into there. I'm sure there's a special tool to do that. I don't have it, and I'll be damned if I spend the money on a special tool to do this once every 3 or 4 years. So that's how I do it. It's in there right. You got your little tab in the little recess on both sides. You got that up across there. It's on there right. And that's basically how I do it. Well, I was going to do the rear brakes too, but quite honestly, I checked the thickness of the used pads and I checked the thickness of the new pads, and the original Ford pads are actually thicker still than what the pads are I'm going to put on, so I'm just defeating my purpose there. I will save those rather than return them, because I'm sure next time I do a brake job on this car, I will probably need the rear ones, but I'm just going to button this back up, and I'm sure the other side's the exact same way, and I'm not going to mess with it. Okay, I'm going to make an attempt to try and show how I do this clip. It's kind of a bumbling mess, and I'll probably be chasing this thing around the garage a couple times, but this is pretty much how I do it without a special tool.
Aaron Donald, and Pat White. Round Labor Day will be back on Tuesday at 2 o'clock. We'll recap the Pirates weekend, react to the Steelers' 53-man roster.
You're going to need a lawyer. You need a firm that has the clout of the big boys. A firm that can focus on what you really need. Stakes are high, and you can't afford to lose. The good news is, Caliper is just one call away.
And it's not totally seated yet, it looks like. There, now you hear it snap. Well, that's how I do it anyways. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. It goes in there and stays, so works for me.